Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
I just thought, given the time I have to speak to you, to really tackle something complicated and that literally would require 3 days. I'm not going to take up the whole duration of the symposium, but I wanted to talk to you about something I care about a lot that has developed over time through my publications on plants. And it's almost like sometimes you think you're focusing on something. You think you're focusing is plants, and then actually you realize that there are very strong roots that lead elsewhere or that ground all these different publications in very interesting ways. And I became more and more aware that realism is one of the bones of contention that I'm wrestling throughout my career. And it wasn't like a complete epiphany. It's like, oh, by the way, all these years I've been writing about realism. But there's a difference between thinking about writing about plants and their relationships with us and art, and actually narrowing down what I think is a deeply problematic area of our relationship with plants, but also of our cultural coevolutions with plants. And just to kind of like throw out a few ideas to give us a baseline, realism is complicated, right? This is a multidisciplinary gathering. And I'm sure that as I say realism, you're all thinking about realism within your own subjects, right? You're thinking about realism in science, realism in theater, in cinema. And in every subject, the term realism means something slightly different, sometimes radically different. These are some of the books that have informed my understanding of realism. And over time, I've come to accept the idea that no definition of realism does justice to what I see happening in contemporary art. I've realized that every time an artist shows something or displays something that entails some kind of realism, they recraft and remold that term in sometimes very nuanced and imperceptible ways. It's like a vernacular that constantly gets molded slightly differently. Initially, I found that daunting, and then I found that extremely exciting, and that's where I am right now. I think I'm like in the groove of realism. But like I said, I've been in the groove of realism for a while. I spent a lot of time thinking about taxidermy and how taxidermy deceives us through its indexical realism. I'm going to talk briefly about why indexical realism is really interesting, I think, in contemporary art. In my book, Speculative Taxidermy, I talk extensively about decorum and how, despite the heightened realism of the taxidermy skin, ideology runs rife in the way the taxidermists pose the animals. So these are basically classical sculptures in disguise. They're furry classical sculptures. And they inform our gender, and they inform normativity in so many ways. Decorum is such an incredibly powerful thing that we give for granted, that subliminally tells us who we are meant to be and how we ought to behave and what we should or shouldn't say. So that's where I became more interested in this construction. You know, we know that, of course, realism is part of a construction. It's always ideological. It's always political, especially if contextualized in certain ways. And it's incredibly good. Any really good work that entails realism is extremely good at erasing the traces of the artist. And I explored realism further through my book, Lucian Freud Herbarium. Lucian Freud was extremely keen, especially after 1951, when he switched his style dramatically, to capture the detailed nuances of his house plants. And I kind of elaborated ideas around the notion of a plant identity in this book and in others that followed. What does it mean, according to Lucian Freud, to stare at a plant with such intensity that he thought the gaze alone could evince something truthful through the depiction, through the realistic depiction of a plant about existence more broadly? I thought that proposition was incredibly interesting, especially because It just flew in the face of the tradition of still life from the Dutch Golden Age that we know so well, where we find this paradox embedded in the very idea of realism. We have a form of hyper-realistic representation here that is lying between its teeth to us about everything. These blooms never came together. The artists never sat in front of them. It's impossible to paint these plants at the speed required by both, right? They're on different time scales. They're all copied from other artists' paintings, botanical treatises, sketches the artists made elsewhere. So these are like assemblages where different time scales just gather and are all bashed together into a utopia that I love. It's hard not to love them. I mean, like, the lighting is everything, isn't it? The lighting is just blending everything realistically so that the illusion of realism can come together. And I absolutely love that. However, I wrote about the silence of plants and how this type of engagement with realism tampers, disrespects, objectifies plants by imposing a vocalization, our human morals, ethics. I wish I had more time to talk to you about how complex these still lives are. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the origin of these still lives, the Protestant Reformation, artists needing to make money, being forbidden to paint saint Madonnas and Jesuses. They channel Christian teachings through flowers and plants. And I've always found that complex in our relationship with plants and problematic on a number of levels. I know you're all familiar with the concept of plant blindness, and paradoxically, this is plant blindness. So the whole of Western art has sort of pretended to invite us to look at plants, to really just hold a mirror to our faces constantly. And that, of course, has led to this objectification of nature. It has led to so much diminishing of what plants and animals, of course, are about. And in this talk, I also combine my concerns about realism and how deceitful it can be with notions of political art. I disagree with Timothy Morton that all art is ecological. We can talk about this later if you like, certainly no time here. Also, I don't believe that all art is political, right? This all is something that just makes everything into nothing. And for instance, an example of political art, very famous, Jacques-Louis David and his portrayal of Napoleon, where you can see here that there's a lot of aggrandizing going on. What I love about this painting, and I never get tired to talk to my students about it, is this kind of like response by De La Roche, who actually brought a level of realism to the truth of what was actually happening on the Alps. So back to that power, right? Realism constructs truth. It's a highly ideological tool. It's been used by many artists, especially during the 19th century. Think photography, the invention of photography, 1826, 1839, changes the world. The invention of cinema, of course, comes after this incredible painting by Manet that shocked because of its heightened realism, right? The dirt under the feet of Olympia, her visible nipples, all these details, the ugliness of Courbet's funeral at Ornans, the people that showed too much rawness on their faces and real suffering. But of course, we also have socialist realism, right? Once again, screens, smoke, and portrayals that not only construct truth, but they create a feedback loop. That's one of the incredible abilities of realism, because it looks like what we perceive around us with our eyes. It implicitly says to us, trust me, I'm telling you the truth. Foucault talked extensively about what he called Quattrocento painting, right? Renaissance painting. And he talks about how it's always affirmative. And I love that notion. He's right. Any true realist work of art, or work of art that deploys realism, always tells the viewer, this is. There is no room for speculation. There is no room for ambiguity. There is no room for questioning. Therefore, the viewer is pacified, becomes a passive spectator of a performance in which everything happens on this stage that keeps creating and crafting truth. So it is in the context of these problematics that I have started to work on this concept of vegetal realism. And I could have come here showing you something polished and something finished, but you've got those books I showed you earlier. If you'd like to take a look, there's polished and finished there. But I really wanted to use this opportunity to gather some thoughts with you about this process. So what is vegetal realism, according to me, at this stage in the journey? It's an ethical aesthetic approach that centers on the unique agency, histories, and ecological significance of specific and situated plant life. It forges connections and foregrounds entwinements between vegetal being and human histories of displacement, resilience, and coevolutions. It prioritizes acts of witnessing, regeneration, and respectful co-creation over instrumental representation, seeking to honor and respect the alterity of plants while illuminating interdependent networks of cultural, ecological, and political meaning. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that if we look back at the history of the last century and the first original, not necessarily conventionally objectifying instances of plant presence in art, we encounter incredible works like these that have been mostly erased from the history of art book. How many of you have seen this before? See? But we all know Duchamp's urinal, right? Of course we know. So Edward Steichen brought delphiniums that he had gigantified through selection to MoMA. This is not something that happened in a small kind of provincial museum, therefore we can excuse the reason why it was like mostly erased. It's got to do with plants. That's why it was mostly erased by the history of art book. I say mostly, I think it actually has been completely erased. Interesting, indeed. My problem with it is that it does a lot, and it does many interesting things related to the conception of the work of art, time, durability, fetishization. There is so much in that gesture of replacing the representation of a plant with the presentation of a plant in the museum, right? A plant that will perish, a plant that cannot be collected by the institution, a plant that will, by its very, very definition, just make the whole institutional discourse of the museum crumble. We do find plants in Helioiticica tropicalia. Love Helioiticica. This is one of those works that gives curators a headache because of the biohazard it poses to museums. Plants here represent a sort of abstracted notion of Brazil as a tropical fantasy to the Western tourist. So my hunch here is that the plant gets objectified by being generalized. Other example, Joseph Cassatt, we get this very famous paradigm that he explores with different objects. 1 in 3 plants, in this case, can be staged with different plant species. The work, the meaning of the work is not affected by the replacement of the plant. Neither it matters where the plant comes from, or how old it is, who grew it, right? The plant becomes this stand-in as part of the semantic structure of the work itself. So more recently, I've become interested in forms of vegetal realism. So I'm trying to kind of get my head around what these artists are doing. One of them is Eddie Rodolfo Parisio that I want to briefly talk to you about. And the other one is Tuitstanat Cis Weiss. They work with very different media and in very different ways. This is the work of Eddie Rodolfo Parisio, and Gardens are Cis Weiss medium. So I'm not trying to create a protocol for artists to follow. That would be dreadful. What I'm trying to do is to wrap my head around what artists are doing, because with every work, they teach me something new about what what I thought was realism, right? And I really enjoy following them. So teach me what realism is in your work. What I'm coming to understand here is that with every work involving plants, we encounter a new conception of realism that is doing something to our conception of plants and our conception of our relationship with them. So, just in a nutshell, I encountered the work of Eddie Rodolfo Parisio at Mocha Geffen a couple of years ago now, and I was blown away. These are enormous skins, as you can see, and they look almost shroud-like, and they are casts of ceiba and ficus trees that used to live in LA, planted during the 40s and 50s to create shadow in the city, of course. And they have now been earmarked for eradication. Why? Because they're doing this to the sidewalks. Their root systems are particularly challenging to the infrastructure of the city. So Parisio does not depict trees, he creates relics of their lived pasts to foreground entwined and very real history of exploitation and subjugation. Through his meticulous rubber castings of ceiba and ficus bark, he looks at the current dislocation and removal of Latin American immigrants that were brought to the United States at the same time as these trees to enrich the community and support the development of the city, but that are now seen as undesirable. So the artist engages with plants as both living material, witness, and memories. Indexicality, in this case, lies at the heart of the process. The surfaces he captures are direct imprints, scars, carvings, cracks, and growth, recorded in all their topographical precision. The skins are not merely aesthetic objects, they are testimonies, silent archives of coexistence, resilience, and erasure. A detail I found particularly interesting is that Parisio uses the rubber created from the Castilla elastica tree in order to capture the skin of these trees. And this is a species native to El Salvador, which is also connected to the history and biography of the artist. So you can see these connections between his life, cultures of immigrants that live in LA that are being now central to contemporary diasporas, and the specific histories of these trees, the species that are chosen, and their situatedness is central to the works. I can show you quickly some of the images here of how beautiful and haunting these skins are. In some of them, he combines clothing from people who have been dispossessed and removed forcibly, creating this blurring between the boundaries of nature and culture. And quickly to outline the work of Cease Wise. Cease Wise, as I mentioned earlier, works with gardens. As an indigenous artist, she is particularly concerned with building communities and creating living works of art. To me, that really is one of the biggest revolutions that's taking place right now in the contemporary environment. Gardens are the new galleries, right? They are challenging institutional constructs, conceptions of what an artwork should be, and they bring people together to generate sustenance. But what Cease Wise does that it's extremely important to me, and we talked extensively about this, is that she cares about the long-term impact of these gardens. We were talking about what does it mean to build a garden for an institution, and our consensus in the conversation was that we need to educate institutions to understand that a garden is a living work of art. And there's a whole framework that we need to develop together to make sure that museums do not take on the trendiness of having artists growing a garden just to dismantle it when the exhibition comes to an end. A garden has a legacy. A garden has a continuous life that invites other artists to partake into a dialogue, into a discourse. So just to conclude my theorization kind of extemporaneous to a degree of vegetal realism, just wanted to propose that it's a productive framework for artists engaging with plant life. This approach transcends traditional representations, fostering a collaborative relationship between artists and plants. Rather than imposing symbolic meanings, vegetal realism emphasizes an empathic alignment with the unique identities, histories, and agencies of plants. This paradigm does not reject symbolism outright. Instead, it advocates for a thoughtful integration where symbolism arises organically, stemming from the plant's identity, its history, and coevolution with humans, other animals, and the soil. By foregrounding the plant's own narratives, artists create works that are multidimensional, intertwining political, ecological, biological, and mythological threads. In embracing vegetal realism, artists can contribute to a broader discourse that recognizes plants as active participants in our shared environment. Thank you.
Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School, r.hds.harvard.edu, copyright 2025, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.